Welcome to one of the darkest and most unsettling cases in Kentucky history. Before we get started, drop a comment with where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening, because we are always curious to know how far these stories travel and at what hour they reach you. The autumn of 1907 settled over Harlan County with an unusual quiet. Pine Mountain stretched long shadows across the valleys, where hunting cabins dotted the land along the Cumberland River. County records preserved by the Harlan County Historical Society tell us that between September and December of that year, 7 hunters entered those woods and never came back. Their disappearances were carefully noted in the ledgers of County Clerk Thomas Whitfield, each entry listing a man's age, his occupation, his last known location, and the haunting words, "No remains recovered." The Harlan Daily Enterprise reported the vanishings as isolated tragedies, blaming storms, rough terrain, or wild animals. In an editorial on October 28, 1907, the paper coldly remarked that the wilderness claims its due each season, echoing the way people at that time accepted the dangers of the Appalachian frontier. But years later, evidence surfaced that suggested something far more sinister had taken place. In 1962, a federal project to develop recreational areas that would become part of the Daniel Boone National Forest led to the discovery of journals hidden beneath a floorboard in a long-abandoned homestead 23 miles southeast of Harlan. The work crew's foreman, Samuel Ledbetter, documented the find in an Internal Forest Service memo dated June 17, 1962. Inside the cabin, they uncovered 3 leather-bound volumes that had belonged to Tobias and Elijah Blackwood brothers, who inherited around 300 acres of dense woodland after their father's death in 1899. Their land stretched from the Cumberland waters to the ridge of Pine Mountain, covering Bear Creek Hollow and the eastern face of Stony Point. The journals, written on handmade paper, contained nearly a decade of daily entries, ending in late 1907, the same year those hunters disappeared. What you are about to hear is a reconstruction drawn from those journals, county records, faded newspapers, and interviews with descendants of Harlan residents. Though the investigation was never officially closed, the case was eventually filed away in 1967 within the Kentucky State Historical Society, where it has remained largely forgotten. The Blackwood brothers themselves were remembered in neighboring McCreary County as secretive trappers who traded furs in Whitley City, a rough logging outpost founded in 1868. At that time, the town was nothing more than a general store, a small church, and a few wooden homes along a muddy road. Trading post ledgers kept by storekeeper Harold Jenkins between 1903 and 1906 show the Blackwoods appearing roughly every 3 months to exchange animal pelts for supplies. A quiet but steady reminder of their presence in the wilderness where so many men vanished. Jenkins's record books, donated to the McCreary County Historical Society by his granddaughter in 1948, reveal the supplies the Blackwood brothers typically purchased. Salt, coffee beans, ammunition, and the occasional tool made up most of their trade. Only rarely did Elijah allow himself the luxury of tobacco. The ledgers show that the brothers spoke little, conducted their exchanges quickly, and always returned to their property before other customers arrived. One entry dated March 12, 1905, reads that the Blackwoods came at dawn, trading 7 fox pelts, 3 beaver, and a remarkable bearskin. In return, they acquired their usual staples, plus a steel trap and a whetstone, paying the balance in silver coins minted decades earlier. Harold Jenkins later wrote in his private diary that the men carried themselves with such a cold stillness that other patrons instinctively stepped aside. An entry from November 1904 describes Tobias Blackwood, the elder brother, as a towering 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders like an ox, and hands scarred from years in the wilderness, yet counting coins with the precision of a banker. His younger brother, smaller, but no less unsettling, would always position himself near the door, scanning the street as though anticipating danger that never came. Jenkins noted that the pair moved through his store like wolves, among sheep, leaving him uneasy, even though nothing was ever stolen. He also observed that they seemed far healthier than most mountain men, especially during the long winters when game was scarce. When asked about their success, Tobias would only offer the same cryptic answer: "We have our ways of keeping the table full." Jenkins recorded that line several times over the years, each time hinting at his unease over their uncanny prosperity. Their cabin stood in a clearing nearly 17 miles from the nearest neighbor, reached only by a narrow path twisting through the pines. James Harkins, the son of a logger who once delivered supplies there in 1901, told local historian Margaret Wilson in 1964 that his father described strange stone markers lining the trail arranged in such a way that he felt watched as he passed. The path itself was unusually well kept, wide enough for a horse, but not for a wagon, forcing visitors to approach in single file. An 1899 survey map clearly marked the property, but maps produced after 1910 omitted entirely, as though the land itself had erased its memory. The few who saw the cabin described it as unusually large for the wilderness, built of hand-hewn oak logs, fitted with remarkable skill. It stood on a stone foundation that sank 10 feet into the earth, supporting a full underground level accessed by a trap door in the main room. Luther Collins, a hunting guide who claimed to have visited the cabin in 1906, later gave a statement to the Harlan County Sheriff during the investigation into the disappearances. His account, preserved in the files, described a wide central room, dominated by a massive stone fireplace, 2 small adjoining bedrooms, and a separate kitchen with a brick oven set into the wall. What struck him most, however, was the brothers' collection of knives. Displayed on a wooden rack by the kitchen entrance were 30 or 40 blades, some recognizable as hunting and skinning tools, but others shaped like surgical instruments, gleaming polished and arranged in careful order. Elijah once caught me staring at the rows of blades and explained they were family heirlooms, tools passed down from their father, who had served as a field medic during the war. Until the fall of 1907, the Blackwood brothers lived quietly enough to avoid serious notice. Their taxes were always paid on time through a Whitley city lawyer named Jonathan Pierce. His records, discovered years later in a dusty cabinet donated to the County Historical Society, showed little about his peculiar clients. He only met them twice, once after their father's death to settle the estate, and again in 1902 when they requested a document ensuring that if one of them died, the property would go entirely to the other, with no outside claims allowed. Pierce found it odd since the brothers had no known heirs or family, but he honored their request. The courthouse records shed more light. Their father, Sergeant Ezekiel Blackwood, had been a Union soldier with the 13th Kentucky Volunteer Infantry, serving as a hospital assistant during the war. Military files noted he was particularly skilled in amputations, and Pierce's own notes suggested he returned home with unusual dietary needs. In a 1904 letter, Pierce wrote that Ezekiel could eat only very fresh meat prepared in a specific way, or else he would suffer terribly. That condition, his sons explained, was the reason he had chosen such a remote homestead, where game was plentiful and neighbors were few. The brothers grew up isolated, educated only by their father, and neither ever married. Aside from their quarterly trips to trade, they kept to themselves. Parents in the county warned children to stay far from Pine Mountain, though no one ever gave a reason beyond the vague but ominous respect private land. In a 1966 interview, Eliza Jenkins, daughter of the Trading Post owner, recalled her father's unsettling warning. Those who wander onto Blackwood land tend not to wander back off it. What exactly sparked the events of 1907 is uncertain. Some point to the bitter cold that struck early that September. driving game animals higher into the mountains and forcing hunters deeper into the Blackwoods territory. Weather logs from the Louisville Meteorological Station confirmed that the month was unusually harsh, averaging 12 degrees below normal, with a damaging frost hitting as early as September 10th. Others blame a county ordinance passed that same summer one that stripped away private property protections during hunting season. The law preserved in county records allowed licensed hunters to cross property lines between September and December, so long as they caused no damage. The Blackwoods appeared at a county meeting to oppose it, one of their only public appearances, but their protest was ignored. Whatever the cause, it brought strangers onto their land. On September 17, 1907, the first man vanished. William Thornton, a 43-year-old bank clerk from Lexington, had come to Harlan County with 3 companions for their annual hunting trip. The group camped along the Cumberland River, just 7 miles from the Blackwood property. According to his companion, Edward Rollins, William announced he was going to check traps along the eastern ridge of Pine Mountain. He never came back. William Thornton had been in good spirits that morning, according to Rollins. The day before, he had downed a large buck, and now he was eager to set traps in the higher ridges, convinced the sudden cold had driven smaller game uphill. At about 8:30 a.m., he left camp with his Winchester rifle, a skinning knife, and a small pack with food and water. When he failed to return by sundown, his companions grew uneasy. Sheriff Daniels' report, dated September 20th, 1907, recounts that the men waited until nightfall before searching. They eventually discovered Thornton's rifle propped neatly against a tree 4 miles from camp, alongside a canteen, half filled with water and a blood-stained handkerchief. The placement of the weapon suggested it hadn't been dropped in haste but set aside intentionally. No further trace of Thornton was ever found. That same evening, a storm rolled over the mountains, wiping clean whatever tracks or signs might have been left. Daniel's 2 deputies and a band of volunteers scoured the terrain for 3 days, turning up nothing. On September 23rd, the search was called off. Daniels' report closed with a line meant to settle the matter. Thornton's disappearance, while tragic, is consistent with the dangers inherent to hunting in remote areas. His companions returned to Lexington, where Thornton's grieving wife commissioned a headstone in Lexington Cemetery, though there was never a body to bury beneath it. A month later, on October 23rd, another pair of hunters vanished. James and Robert Caldwell brothers from Cincinnati had come south for the season's white-tailed deer. At 28 and 31, they were experienced woodsmen who checked into a boarding house in Cumberland on October 20th, run by a widow named Edith Simmons. They told her they planned to hunt near the Tennessee line in the southern reaches of Harlan County. In a statement to Sheriff Daniels, Mrs. Simmons recalled the men saying they had found promising sign along a creek that fed into the Cumberland, up where the mountains get steep. Though she didn't realize it, she was describing the fringes of the Blackwood land. When the Caldwells failed to return, concern turned to alarm as their horses came back to the stable riderless 2 days later. The animals were still saddled, visibly nervous, but uninjured. Joseph Miller, the stable hand, noted the brothers' saddlebags were stuffed with oilcloth-wrapped cuts of meat, an unusually large amount. Assuming it was venison, Mrs. Simmons prepared it for her boarders. It was eaten before anyone realized the Caldwells were gone for good. By the time the alarm was raised, not only were the men missing, but whatever they had carried back from the mountains had been consumed. When investigators later questioned Mrs. Simmons about the meat the Caldwell brothers had brought back, she insisted there was nothing unusual about it. She remembered only that it was tender, almost delicate, as though from a younger animal. One boarder, a Mr. Douglas from Virginia, had even remarked it was the sweetest venison he had ever eaten, asking where the brothers had hunted so he could try his luck in the same hills. Mrs. Simmons could not recall if she ever told him. Sheriff Daniels launched another search once the brothers were reported missing, scouring the southern ridges where they had said they would hunt. After 5 days, the only clue turned up was a spent rifle cartridge impossible to match to either man's weapon. The Cincinnati Enquirer carried a short article on November 2, 1907, dismissing the men as likely lost to the hazards of Kentucky's unforgiving wilderness. Their parents made the trip south in mid-November, but returned home empty-handed. Robert Caldwell's young wife, pregnant at the time, would give birth to a son in February 1908, who would never know his father. In March, she wrote Sheriff Daniels a desperate letter begging for any word. If he ever replied, it is lost to history. The next disappearance came swiftly. On November 3rd, a German immigrant named Frederick Schmidt arrived in Harlan County. A butcher by trade and an avid hunter, Schmidt signed the register at the Railroad Hotel, noting his plan to hunt for several days before returning to Louisville. He never checked back in. By November 15th, when he failed to report for work, his employer alerted authorities. Nearly 2 weeks had passed, the first snows had set in, and the search that followed was half-hearted at best. Schmidt's distinctive German-made rifle engraved with his name was never recovered. The fourth and fifth vanishings struck closer to home. On November 26th, Thomas Howard, a coal miner, and his brother-in-law Peter Jenkins, a carpenter, left Cumberland for a short 2-day trip into the high country. The two men had lived in Harlan County their entire lives, knew the ridges well, and had hunted these hills since boyhood. When they failed to return on the 28th, their wives' sisters immediately raised the alarm. A search party of miners and neighbors swept the ridges, but the only sign was the men's abandoned campsite. The fire had been doused, their cooking pans were left behind, and a rabbit carcass lay half-skinned and already spoiling. Their rifles were gone, suggesting they had walked away armed, but there was no sign of where they went. Then, on December 12th, the mountains claimed yet another. Reverend Isaiah Thornfield, a traveling preacher from Tennessee, had spent months holding revival meetings across the county. According to his young assistant, Timothy Greer, the Reverend felt called to bring the Word of God to even the most isolated families in the backwoods. Thornfield left on horseback that morning, carrying only a Bible and a small satchel. 3 days later, his horse wandered back to town without him. In its saddlebags lay the preacher's Bible untouched, but his other belongings were missing. Greer rallied members of the congregation to search, but like all the hunts before, it ended with nothing. 6 men were now gone, swallowed by the mountains in less than 3 months. The last disappearance of that terrible season, and the one that lingers with the sharpest chill, came on December 23rd. Mary Caldwell's sister to the 2 missing brothers from Cincinnati arrived in Harlan County, unwilling to accept silence as an answer. Ignoring warnings about the dangerous winter weather, she hired a local guide, Jeremiah Stone, to take her into the mountains where her brothers had last been seen. Stone later told authorities that they set out that morning following the same general route Mrs. Simmons had described weeks earlier. When they reached the foothills of Pine Mountain, Mary insisted on pressing ahead alone to a ridge she believed would offer a clearer view. Stone said he argued, but she was determined, and so he waited with the horses. Half an hour passed before he grew uneasy. He followed her trail up the ridge, but found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign she had ever gone that way. As the daylight faded, he returned to Cumberland for help. A search party formed on Christmas Eve, but a blizzard swept in, burying the mountain in feet of snow and erasing whatever trace Mary Caldwell might have left behind. She was never seen again. By then, 7 lives had vanished into the winter woods in just over 3 months, an unprecedented number that should have prompted swift and serious investigation. But the disappearances were scattered, some locals, some visitors from far-off cities, and the sheriff's attention was divided. Daniels's records show he was contending with violent coal strikes that drained manpower and focus. Harsh weather and treacherous terrain further limited the reach of any search. To the wider world, the story never gained momentum. The Harlan Daily Enterprise ran an editorial on January 8, 1908, noting the unusual number of lost hunters, but blaming it on poor conditions and inexperienced outsiders. Its solution was not an inquiry into foul play, but a call for tighter restrictions on out-of-state hunting licenses. Years passed and memory dulled. The Blackwood land remained untouched, taxes unpaid, after the brothers themselves ceased appearing at the trading post. The county reclaimed the property in 1932, the official records describing it as abandoned and without structures of value, as though the heavy cabin and its deep foundation had simply been swallowed by the forest. The last trace of the brothers comes from Harold Jenkins's diary. On December 26, 1907, just 3 days after Mary Caldwell disappeared, Elijah Blackwood arrived at his store in Whitley City. Jenkins described him as haggard, distracted, his clothing stained, his manner restless in a way he had never seen before. Elijah carried with him a larger haul of meat and pelts than ever before, and he bought supplies that suggested long travel. Preserved food, ammunition, a new knife, and a heavy coat. When Jenkins asked about Tobias, Elijah answered only, "My brother remains at home tending to private matters." Then he left, heading west instead of north toward his land. That was the last time anyone saw Blackwood alive. For decades, the property lay forgotten until 1962, when the U.S. Forest Service surveyed Pine Mountain for a fire tower. Their work would uncover what the snowstorms and silence of 1907 had hidden for so long. When the Forest Service began clearing ground for the new fire tower in 1962, workers unearthed the charred remains of a cabin. The site report filed by project supervisor Samuel Ledbetter noted that the structure had once stood on a stone foundation that plunged 10 feet into the earth, with evidence of multiple underground rooms, an unusual design for any frontier dwelling of its time. Amid the blackened timbers, the crew recovered a scorched metal box. Inside were 3 leather-bound journals, singed but still legible. The find was quickly judged to be of historical, not criminal significance. The box and its contents were first sent to the Forest Service office in Winchester, then transferred to the State Historical Archives in Frankfurt in 1964. That same year, Dr. Eliza Montgomery, an anthropologist from the University of Kentucky, examined the journals while conducting research on isolated Appalachian communities. Her preliminary report, dated October 3, 1964, described them as an extraordinary glimpse into the psychology of seclusion and the strange moral systems that can evolve in wilderness isolation. 2 distinct hands appeared throughout the volumes, presumed to be those of Tobias and Elijah Blackwood. The earliest entries, from 1899 through early 1907, chronicled hunting successes, weather, property upkeep, and reflections that Montgomery found surprisingly articulate, given the brothers' presumed lack of formal education. But beginning in March 1907, a shift occurred, subtle at first, then unmistakably dark. Tobias began writing with growing intensity about trespassers' encroachments and outsiders. On March 23, 1907, he noted found boot prints along the eastern creek bed. Strangers walking our land without permission or acknowledgement. Father would not have tolerated such trespass. Over the following months, his tone hardened. By August, he was writing of setting deterrents at the property line, though he never described what form those deterrents took. Elijah's entries revealed growing unease. On August 17th, he recorded Tobias rarely sleeps now. He spends nights walking the perimeter. He speaks often of Father's lessons and our duty to the land. I fear the isolation has begun to wear on his mind. He refuses even our customary trading journey this month. Then came the entries that chilled Montgomery to the core. Mixed among daily observations were recipes not for venison or bear, but for what Tobias described as two-legged game. On September 18, 1907, the day after William Thornton vanished, Tobias wrote, "Unexpected bounty yesterday. Trespasser carried identification from a Lexington banking establishment. Elijah processed the meat while I disposed of the remainder as Father taught us. The liver was exceptionally tender when prepared with wild onions and salt. We will preserve the rest, using Father's smoking method for the leaner cuts." From then on, the journals became a ledger of both disappearance and consumption. On October 25th, after the Caldwell brothers vanished, Tobias wrote, "The older one provided better marbling in the flank portions. Elijah objects to my terminology, but Father always said that proper nomenclature ensures proper preparation. We are not savages. We are custodians of ancient knowledge." Elijah's hand grew increasingly frantic. On November 3rd, the day Frederick Schmidt was last seen, he wrote, "Tobias claims we are merely protecting what is ours as Father would have wanted." But Father's hunger was born of necessity in wartime, not the eagerness Tobias now displays. He speaks of setting lures rather than defending our boundaries. I fear this will not end as he believes. By December of 1907, the Blackwood journals revealed a growing fracture between the brothers. Elijah's entries turned restless and fearful. On December 14th, in his careful hand, he wrote, "Confronted Tobias about the preacher." There was no threat there. The man merely sought to bring his God to our door. Tobias said, "All trespassers are the same. Intention matters not when the result is violation of our sanctuary." He becomes more like Father with each passing day. But Father at least maintained control of his appetites. Dr. Montgomery's research into the journals ended abruptly, less than a year after she began. In November 1964, she withdrew her paper from publication, took an immediate sabbatical, and relocated to Oregon. She never returned to the subject. By early 1965, the journals themselves had been locked away in restricted storage after a quiet review by the State Attorney General. A memo attached to the file dismissed the matter as of historical interest, only noting the absence of recoverable remains and the passage of more than half a century. Yet whispers of the Blackwoods did not fade. In 1966, folklore collector Martin Ridley traveled through Harlan County gathering oral histories. Among those he interviewed was 87-year-old Abigail Jenkins, daughter of Harold Jenkins, the Whitley City trader who had known the brothers. Her testimony, preserved in the Library of Congress, cast a chilling light on that final winter. "My father rarely spoke of the Blackwoods," she told Ridley. But near the end of his life, he shared things he had kept secret for decades. She recalled her father describing Elijah's last visit to the trading post in December 1907. His hands shook so badly he could hardly count his coins. His clothes were stained dark, and he reeked of smoke and something her father compared to a slaughterhouse. He carried more meat than ever before, though it was wrapped differently than usual. Elijah claimed it was venison and wild boar. Father said Elijah kept glancing over his shoulder as if he expected someone to come in after him, Abigail recounted. When asked about Tobias, Elijah grew agitated. Her father remembered his words exactly. "Tobias has developed a taste that cannot be satisfied with animal flesh alone. I fear he is changing into something Father always warned about." Elijah paid with gold coins rather than the silver he and his brother had always used. When Jenkins questioned it, Elijah explained the coins had been taken from a trespasser's pockets. Before leaving, he issued a warning. "If Tobias comes looking, you never saw me. For your own safety, remember that." Elijah never returned. In the spring that followed, odd traces surfaced in Knoxville. A pocket watch matching William Thornton's was seen in a pawn shop. A hunting knife known to belong to one of the Caldwell brothers was spotted in a general store. Authorities dismissed the finds as coincidence, attributing them to scavengers or thieves who had stumbled across abandoned camps. No link to the Blackwoods was ever proven, but Abigail Jenkins's interview ended with the detail that haunted her father to his grave. He admitted that during Elijah's last visit, he sampled some of the meat Elijah had brought. Father said he had never been so sick in his life, she told Ridley. He couldn't keep food down for nearly a week. He said it felt as though his body was rejecting something deeply wrong. On his deathbed, Harold Jenkins finally told his daughter what he had long feared. "Abigail," he whispered, "I've carried this knowledge like a stone in my gut for years. That wasn't any deer or boar Elijah brought in that day. I've been a hunter all my life. I know the taste of every animal in these mountains. What I tasted was something else entirely. May God forgive me for it." When Ridley asked Abigail if her father had ever reported his suspicions, she answered simply, "Who would believe such a thing?" By the time he was certain, the brothers had long since vanished into the folds of the mountain. The physical traces of what happened in 1907 were nearly all erased. The Blackwood cabin had burned to the ground, and evidence from the site suggested it was no accident. The Forest Service's 1962 excavation report noted the fire burned at an abnormally high temperature consistent with accelerants and showed multiple points of origin findings that ruled out natural causes like lightning or a chimney spark. But with more than 50 years gone, officials deemed it a matter of historical curiosity, not criminal investigation. In 1967, as construction crews prepared the foundation for a fire tower half a mile from the old cabin site, they unearthed a series of stone-lined pits. Each was 6 feet deep, 8 feet across, carefully built, with fitted stones and sealed with collapsed wooden lids. Initially dismissed as old root cellars, the discovery halted when bone fragments were uncovered among the rubble. Dr. Walter Richardson, a forensic anthropologist brought in by the Forest Service, examined the remains briefly. His official report described them as non-human likely deer or boar, and attributed the cut marks to ordinary butchering practices of the region. Construction resumed, and the pits were quietly filled. But years later, Richardson's original field notes surfaced through a Freedom of Information Act request by journalist Thomas Carter. In those notes, Richardson admitted that some of the larger fragments bore precision cuts, inconsistent with game butchery. The angles suggested a knowledge of anatomy beyond that of a typical hunter or trapper. Without full specimens, he couldn't make a definitive call. But he left the chilling possibility that the fragments might have been human. The fire tower itself stood less than a decade. Officially, it was decommissioned after engineers cited persistent structural faults and equipment failures. But the reports from the rangers assigned there told another story. Many requested transfer, describing strange noises, a lingering odor of cooked meat, and an atmosphere they could not endure. One detailed account filed in August 1970 by Ranger David Coleman described an incident during an overnight shift. Around 2:15 a.m., Coleman awoke to the sound of multiple figures moving around the base of the tower. He called out, shined his light, but saw no one. The footsteps, steady and deliberate, continued for nearly 20 minutes. At dawn, he found footprints circling the tower completely, yet no tracks leading in or away. Coleman filed his report and demanded immediate reassignment. No investigation followed. The fire tower was dismantled in 1974, and the land surrounding the old Blackwood homestead was quietly designated a wildlife conservation zone with restricted access. Official files closed the book on the story. But the most compelling piece of evidence surfaced outside government records, in the hands of a private collector. In 1968, Herbert Simmons, a Civil War memorabilia enthusiast from Knoxville, purchased a trunk of old papers at an estate sale. Among the yellow documents, he found a water-stained letter dated January 3, 1908, written in fading ink and signed by Elijah Blackwood. Recognizing the infamous name, Simmons contacted Dr. Eliza Montgomery, who had by then resumed teaching at the University of Kentucky, but had abandoned her research into the Blackwoods. Montgomery authenticated the letter by comparing its handwriting to Elijah's known journal entries and concluded it was genuine. What the letter contained was not folklore, but confession. Dearest cousin, it began, though we have never met. I write to you as my last remaining blood relation, according to father's records. What I must confess may never reach your eyes, as I doubt my resolve to post it. Yet I must set down the truth before I depart this world, or lose my mind entirely. In its wavering script, Elijah revealed that his father, Ezekiel Blackwood, had not only served as a Union field medic during the Civil War, but had survived the winter of 1865 by consuming the flesh of dead soldiers. According to Elijah, Ezekiel came to believe that human flesh, particularly from those who lived clean lives and abstained from drink, contained properties that granted strength and longevity. Ezekiel had taught his sons to prepare this ultimate sustenance in ways he claimed preserved its essence, and to dispose of remains so nature would erase the evidence. Elijah admitted that after their father's death in 1899, he and Tobias swore to leave the practice behind. But during the brutal winter of 1901, when a fever-stricken trapper stumbled into their cabin, Tobias reverted. He justified killing the man as self-defense. But Elijah recalled the gleam in his brother's eyes as he butchered him, the same hunger that had consumed their father in his final years. From then on, the brothers made a grim pact. They would only consume those who trespassed and posed some threat, convincing themselves it was both protection and punishment. For years, that dark compromise held. But in 1907, when the county ordinance allowed hunters to cross private property lines, the woods around Pine Mountain filled with outsiders. Tobias Elijah wrote changed. What had once been reluctant necessity became obsession. He began to set snares, not for deer, but for men tracking their movements, studying their camps, and choosing his targets as if he were stalking prized game. The final break came on Christmas Eve of 1907. Elijah returned to the cabin to find Tobias preparing a stew. Among the discarded belongings, he recognized a young woman's clothing. She had been searching for her missing husband. When I saw those garments, Elijah wrote something inside me broke. I knew then that father's curse had passed fully to my brother. Elijah's letter revealed the final break between the brothers. Father had been explicit that women were never to be considered suitable, he wrote. Something fundamental had changed in Tobias. He was consuming not for sustenance, but for pleasure. The expression on his face as he stirred that pot haunts me still. For Elijah, this crossed a line that even years of darkness could not erase. That night, Elijah claimed he ended it. I struck him from behind with father's old army shovel as he bent over the hearth. I told myself it was mercy, not murder, that the brother I had known was already gone, replaced by something that merely wore his face. I poured coal oil over everything that would burn and lit the flame I hoped would purify what we had become. Perhaps it is cowardice that I did not join him in that pyre. The letter closed with a chilling confession of hunger that never left him. I feel it still, cousin, the craving father planted in us. In my dreams I taste it still, and wake famished for something dear and rabbit cannot satisfy. I go west to lose myself where no one knows the name Blackwood. Yet I fear what father awakened in our blood can never truly be put to rest. If there is a God, may he forgive what we have done in these mountains. I know I shall never forgive myself. When Herbert Simmons, the collector, brought the letter forward in 1968, authorities dismissed it outright. Too much time had passed, and no evidence remained to prosecute. After Simmons's death the following year, his collection was dispersed and the original letter vanished. Dr. Montgomery, who had authenticated and transcribed it, refused to speak further. Some historical materials, she said, are best left unexamined. And so the Blackwood story slipped back into silence, leaving behind only folklore and unease. To this day, the southeastern corner of Daniel Boone National Forest, where their land once stood, remains curiously avoided. Despite its game-rich ridges and sweeping vistas, hunters and hikers alike pass it over. A Forest Service analysis in 1978 noted it as one of the least visited areas of the entire Appalachian Range. Local guides offer excuses: treacherous terrain, conservation zones, but their words often echo something deeper. Jeremiah Holbrook, a seasoned hunter, said it plain: "There are places in these mountains that don't welcome human presence." That's one of them. Animals know it too. You won't find deer or turkey in that hollow, no matter how good the foraging might be. The land stands empty, the cabin long gone, yet the silence of Pine Mountain holds its memory. And perhaps, as Elijah himself feared, some hungers are never truly put to rest. Park rangers interviewed for the 1978 assessment admitted to an unofficial policy discouraged visitors from setting foot in that hollow. "We don't put it in the guidelines," one ranger explained, "but new staff are quietly told to steer people elsewhere. Too many incidents, gear failing without cause, strange injuries, hikers losing their way even with compass and map." Another ranger, speaking anonymously, went further. "There's something not right about that place. Animals avoid it. Plants grow wrong, they're twisted, even though the soil and light are no different. We just tell people it's under rehabilitation. Official maps reflect that avoidance." The precise coordinates of the Blackwood cabin disappeared from topographical surveys after 1970. Instead of a detailed plot, there's a small blank patch explained away as a surveying error never corrected. Former Forest Service employees have suggested it was no error at all, but a deliberate omission. Those who probed too deeply into the Blackwood case often paid a price. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, who first analyzed the journals, abruptly left her promising academic track, retreating to a small teaching post in Oregon and refusing to speak of her research again. Journalist Thomas Carter, whose FOIA request exposed discrepancies in the official record, published only a single article in a regional magazine before abandoning the subject. When later contacted, he warned simply, "Some stories carry consequences for those who tell them." Folklorist Martin Ridley, who interviewed Abigail Jenkins, died suddenly of a heart attack within weeks of depositing his recordings, though he had no prior history of heart disease. Dr. Chet Richardson, the anthropologist who examined the bone fragments, requested reassignment to California shortly after submitting his findings. He never published in forensic anthropology again. Over the decades, the tale of the Blackwoods was thinned out in oral tradition. Around campfires, it became little more than a story of two reclusive hermits who may have harmed trespassers. The darker implications of cannibalism erased by silence or denial. Yet every so often, rumors surface: hikers stumbling across strange stone formations, hunters finding rusted tools in clearings that don't appear on any map. In 1992, a backpacker reported a stone-lined pit like those documented in 1967. When rangers checked the coordinates, nothing was there. The man later recanted, blaming disorientation in the dense woods. The last official mention appears in a 1973 memo from the Kentucky State Police Archives. It ordered all case materials on the 1907 disappearances transferred to deep storage marked for preservation, but excluded from public catalogs. At the bottom was a peculiar addendum: annual verification of secure containment required. Why a case closed for over 60 years would demand yearly security checks remains unexplained. And in 2002, When a Freedom of Information Act request sought access to those same files, the petition was denied on the grounds of ongoing investigation. The story of the Blackwoods lies buried in that hollow half-fact, half-folklore, and wholly unresolved. Some truths, it seems, are never meant to be brought back into the light. When questioned, state officials brushed off the restricted zone as a clerical error, but still barred access to the files. Yet to this day, every hunting license issued in Harlan County includes a map marked with a shaded block labeled Only Environmentally Sensitive Zone. No hunting permitted. That zone corresponds exactly to the land once owned by the Blackwoods. No order of conservation explains it. No environmental initiative accounts for it. Locals don't press for answers. They simply avoid the place, especially in autumn, when the hunger of predators grows sharpest. In 1968, a journalist from the Louisville Courier-Journal tried to unravel the mystery by interviewing the few surviving witnesses. Most refused to speak, but one man in his 90s offered words that may best capture the lingering presence of the Blackwoods. The mountains remember what people try to forget. Those brothers weren't the first to develop unusual appetites in these hills, and I doubt they'll be the last. Some hungers don't die with the men who felt them. They sink into the soil, seep into the water, and wait for someone new to feed them. The journalist's article was never printed. His notes were later found in an abandoned car at the forest's edge. He was discovered days later in a Nashville hospital under a false name with no memory of what had happened. He left journalism soon afterward, telling later researchers only, "Some stories aren't meant to be told. Some appetites shouldn't be remembered. But forgetting has its price." What happened in those woods in the autumn of 1907 transformed 7 missing persons cases into a legacy of silent, sealed records and a place where even the wildlife refuses to tread. The hollow where the Blackwood cabin once stood remains lifeless, a patch of silence in a forest otherwise alive with sound. And sometimes silence speaks loudest. In recent decades, rangers have noted that fires erupt along the eastern ridge of Pine Mountain in late September or October, always within the boundaries of the old Blackwood land. The flames burn hot and fast, but never spread beyond that invisible line. Afterward, among the blackened soil, strange circles of stones appear patterns that look like cooking pits, newly arranged in places where no visitors are allowed. Maybe it's the wind. Maybe it's erosion. Or maybe, as the old stories warn, some appetites never die. They smolder beneath the soil, waiting for hunting season, when strangers once again step into the woods of Harlan County, Kentucky.